Alice Speri is a reporter with The Intercept. She writes about U.S. foreign policy abuses by military and security forces and the repression of dissent. She's reported from Palestine, Haiti, El Salvador, Colombia, and across the United States. But she's originally from Italy and lives in the Bronx. Gotta share that. Gotta share it. I've never said Alice. I learned something new today. I love that.
Thank you. And thanks for having me too.
Of course. So you have this article that just came out in The Intercept titled Anti-BDS Laws Could Upend the Constitutional Right to Engage in Boycott. And just like we're sitting here today watching the Supreme Court, possibly overturn Roe v. Wade based on a long conservative fight at the local level in state legislatures over the last 35, 40 years, you're seeing similar actions in many other areas. It's like they're literally checking off the boxes through state level organizing at a time in which Democrats have been like MIA locally. So, tell us about Boycott, the film, and what's been happening at the local level.
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. So Boycott is a new film that just premiered in New York last month. It's produced by Just Vision, which is this group that kind of, looks to fill a bit of a media gap when it comes to Israel and Palestine and really highlight, for the most part, activists and organizers in Palestine and Israel doing work there. And this film is a bit different for them because they actually focus on a very U.S. story. It's a very local story. The focus is basically on this anti-BDS legislation that for several years now has been passed at the state level across the country. There have been 33 bills passed at the state level, but more than 200 that have actually been introduced over the last several years and really have pretty much flown under the radar, which I think is what's so important about this film, is that it really sheds a light on this very deliberate, very calculated long-term effort, as you put it, to pass this legislation. Your viewers might be familiar with the fact that there was an effort to pass such legislation at the federal level. Some of it would have actually criminalized boycott in Israel, but that fell through for now anyway. But at the state level, nobody really was pushing back, and so a bunch of these bills were passed that essentially, most of them, target contractors, state contractors, so basically use the power of the state to provide money to people and companies that choose to engage with in a boycott of Israel.
Okay, so let's help me understand that more. Like, what do you mean by contractors? I mean, I think people are very familiar with what's happening with Ben and Jerry's right now and how out of control it's gotten. I was really surprised by, and they're standing their ground. But is it something similar to that, or is this Ben and Jerry's, of course, saying that they're no longer going to be selling in the West Bank?
Right. I mean, there are a number of bills. They are not all the same, although all of them seek to sort of stifle criticism of the Israeli occupation of Palestine in different ways. So in some states, in New York, for instance, we have the state choosing not to invest the state pensions in companies that boycott Israel. In other states, the punishing for kind of people that are critical of the occupation is much more direct. So we first actually at The Intercept reported about this. One of the characters in this film, Bahia Hamawi, who's this Palestinian-American child speech pathologist in Texas, who lost her contract with the Austin public school system when she refused to sign a pledge saying that she will not boycott Israel. So a lot of people kind of learned about these bills when they saw this new phrase pop up in their contract and this new pledge requiring them not to boycott Israel and promise they would not boycott Israel. Another character the film follows is Mick Jordahl, who was an attorney in Arizona who had a state contract to provide legal services for incarcerated people in the county jail system, and who also had this language thrown into his contract and refused to sign. So what this does is essentially target state contractors and withhold state contracts and withhold business from the state if people do not sign this pledge that they will not boycott Israel. And what's interesting is, one of the stories that the film follows is that of this Arkansas publication, the Arkansas Times, whose whose newsroom was not even involved in a boycott to start with. They were not interested in the BDS movement. They were not actively participating. They just refused to sign the pledge on principle because they thought the state had no business telling them.
Because they're journalists?
Which exactly. So like what I think really is striking about this film and this story is the fact that this is, of course, about Palestine and the BDS movement, but it really is about First Amendment and kind of your constitutional liberties that, so many of us take for granted all the time that are being eroded at the state level with absolutely no pushback. One of the most fascinating scenes in the film is, I describe it in the story, but the filmmakers are interviewing this Republican state senator in Arkansas who was the main sponsor of this bill and accidentally run into a Democrat who voted for the bill, just like the rest of the state legislature, who had no idea he voted for the bill, who had never even, stopped to read the bill and question whether this is even constitutional or not. And this is really how a lot of these bills were passed. It might not surprise your viewers to know that ALEC, the American Legislative Council, was behind a lot of this legislation, as they often are behind kind of this state level conservative pushes to, get through legislation just with no scrutiny. I think that that's really the key element here. There was some pushback against this legislation in some states, but really not much. And actually, one of the the quotes in the film that I think is just fascinating is this Arkansas state senator is saying, the Palestinian side was not here advocating the other side of the issue. This just flew through. Nobody questioned it. And I think it's it is so telling that the moment you present a bill as pro-Israel, there is just no questioning from Republicans and Democrats alike. Nobody wants to go there. Nobody wants to risk saying anything.
And some of that is, AIPAC has spent a lot of money over the years, sending local lawmakers on the Democratic side and, of course, Republican side to Israel for essentially their propaganda trips. Now, that's normal for a lot of organizations to do that, especially foreign interests. But they've really put people through a pipeline and kept them there. And for the most part, folks have stayed true. I mean, I think there have been a few people who've said like, "Oh, I've changed my mind. I've evolved on this issue," but they won't go to war with them. And that I think is fascinating. Is like once you like what you just said, it's just not worth it. So they just sign it. They're not going to be, necessarily the biggest advocate, but they're also not going to be an opponent. Because what happens? I mean, what happens when somebody stands up to Israel? I mean, we see what's happening with Ilhan Omar, but what happens?
Yeah, that's the problem. The political cost of saying anything that's vaguely critical of Israel is just, so huge for elected officials that nobody really wants to touch it. But what's interesting about these bills is that it's putting that cost on everybody else, right? You might be an attorney providing legal services in Arizona who cannot say anything about Israel, or you lose your job, right? You might be a speech therapist in Texas who does not want to sign this pledge. You will lose your state contract. So this is really kind of expanding the burden, expanded impact of this political influence, which is ultimately what this is. And what a lot of these people are saying who file suits in their states against this legislation, what they're saying is like, this is like such an un-American legislation to have. I mean, this goes, of course, against our Constitution, but really, you're giving precedence to a foreign government. You're allowing a foreign government to meddle in our own rights, and that is really, why they filed suit and while they fought back against this legislation to really kind of uphold their rights as Americans. And one point they make, and I think the film makes very well, and that it's very concerning, is that this is really not just about the BDS movement. Texas, for instance, which is one of the states that had this legislation, has already used that legislation to pass similar bills that essentially make it impossible for people to get state contracts if they boycott fossil fuels or firearms. And so you can really just kind of see the possibilities of this. All you need to do is change a few words in the legislation, and you can target any other cause, on whatever side of the political spectrum, because who knows how this could be used down the line. So it's really really kind of pervasive and dangerous, regardless of whether one supports the BDS movement or not.
Is it just coming from ALEC, or is this being funded? I mean, when did this start to operationalize, and where's the money? Like, where can you track it?
Yeah, so this is another really interesting part of the story. The bills came in response to growing international support for the BDS movement, which you might remember is a Palestinian-led peaceful movement. And I think this is really important because people tend to kind of not sort of acknowledge where this movement came from. This is a Palestinian civil society initiative and a Palestinian call for solidarity to the international community that was taken up in recent years and has grown quite significantly. The Israeli government, of course, has very much opposed that. And one of the kind of reporting threads this film follows is the funding that flew from the Israeli government through this non-governmental organization they set up, because they cannot directly, of course, influence U.S. legislative processes. So the Israeli government set up this group that funded U.S. groups, including Christian groups in the U.S. One of the most prominent ones is Christians United for Israel, which in turn lobbied for these bills very aggressively. And I think this is another very interesting aspect of the story. The film explores this, sort of marriage of convenience and opportunism, if you will, between the Christian evangelicals and the Israeli government, where there is this common cause that's, for the Christian evangelicals, is basically they want Israel's biblical borders to be restored so that Jesus Christ can come back to earth. And the Israeli government is very happy to go along with it as long as it builds U.S. support.
They're willing to go along with the alien theory as long as I know that's the case. It's just every time I think about it, I'm like, okay.
It's quite fascinating. But this is, we laugh about it, but it's really how these policies are ultimately passed. I mean, the state senator in Arkansas I mentioned, he says that in the film, when like no shame. He's like, when Jesus Christ comes back to earth, everybody, Jews included, will go to hell. And this is why we support this anti-BDS legislation, so that can happen faster, right? So it's really, really striking. And I think it's a story that, some people are starting to pay attention to, but it just has not garnered the amount of attention it should, I think.
Where can people watch this film if they want to see it right now?
Well, they should go to Just Vision's website and check out promotional material. I am not sure whether it is available online yet. It's premiered in film theaters in New York for now. And
in New York, where can people see it?
It was at the NYC Doc Festival last month. I'm not sure if it's still screening, but it will.
We'll put that information up. Sorry.
No worries. And actually, I think Just Vision does a lot of work with, kind of sending their films out to schools and different groups across the country, like really want them shown, particularly because this is the kind of story that the media tend to ignore, right? So even the anti-BDS legislation itself, with the exception of some local coverage of these different lawsuits where they happen, there just has not been a very significant effort to cover this bill systematically, to watch what's happening across the country, to just follow these legal challenges, which, by the way, is a very important part of the story, because some of the plaintiffs, some of the people who are profiled in the film, won their lawsuits against their states, against Texas, against Arizona, but the Arkansas case actually is up at the 8th Circuit right now. They originally lost, appealed, and won, and now the case has been reheard, and it could end up before the Supreme Court, which obviously has massive implications for the right to boycott anything.
Exactly, which is free speech. I mean, I think the most fascinating aspect of this is essentially a foreign government. I mean, you could say the same thing about Saudi Arabia. You could say the same thing about any foreign government. We have more freedom to challenge our own government than we do other governments, which is, oftentimes we say that we're the empire and we're the colonizers, but makes you think a little bit.
Yeah, but what's interesting about these bills is that if the government rules, as the Arkansas Attorney General is trying to do, that you have no right to boycott, that is not a constitutionally protected right, which, by the way, is a paradox, because the Supreme Court has already ruled that much. 40 years ago, there was a very well-known case about the boycott of white-owned businesses in Mississippi, and the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that boycott is actually constitutionally protected. But now we're back in court, and there are, the government's trying to interpret that differently, and maybe suggest that you can actually call for a boycott but not engage in one. And so, as we've seen with abortion and other things we have long taken for granted, that's back in question. And it really, I think, shows how fragile the constitutional protections we take for granted are, and how insidious this legislation is when you don't pay attention. As was the case with abortion, you have all these bills being passed at the local level here and there, and there's, eventually something sticks. Eventually you get a judge to rule in favor, and this is where you end up, back in
especially if you have conservatives who've just dominated in appointing these justices for many for life. And of course, the Democrats, theme of the day, when Democrats don't exist locally, you have Republicans dominating, and this is their 40 plus year experiment, is to take control at every single aspect of government. And then Democrats come in, have the Senate, the House, and the presidency like once every 20 years and then lose it. So
when it comes to Israel, they're like, there's basically no difference between
exactly.
Essentially. So that in general, yes, that's of course the case, but it doesn't even matter here, basically.
But the local, using this as a precedent now, I mean, this is the problem, is that if there are Democrats who have the same beliefs, Zionist-led beliefs, that's one thing. But now this is take your beliefs aside and look at it from a legal perspective. There are a lot of, this is where the law and being a judge is important. You might have a personal belief over something, but then there's just the constitutional right. And it could be a precedent for so many other things. And which is why, that one case was one, even though it's clearly leaning towards white business owners. So.
Right. Yeah. And, what's interesting with the Arkansas Times case, which is now at the 8th Circuit, is the state senator who lobbied for this bill is actually saying, I don't care if they lose business because I don't like what they publish anyway, which is really not about Israel, not about the, he's kind of, like saying the silent part out loud. Like it just, the fact that there is no interest in kind of protecting your state's newspaper's right to publish what they like, let alone the right to boycott, which they're not actively engaging in, is really just telling and kind of terrifying, frankly.
Slippery slope. Alice Speri, reporter at The Intercept, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing this story. It's super fascinating. Hopefully folks will be able to check out the film wherever they are, even if they don't agree, because that is a right that we have in our country, is to be able to see different sides of an argument. And even if you don't agree with, understand that fundamentally we have constitutional rights, and they're just basically tapping into a nerve and an opportunity to organize around fundamentally cutting our rights, whether or not, that's their agenda or not. Alice, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.